So, welcome to Moral Development. This week is pretty fun. I get to ask you guys some moral dilemmas. We're going to look at how kids develop morally. It's a pretty interesting week. First, I want you to start off by reading this lovely Calvin and Hobbes little story. So I love this little comic. It's a good example. Calvin says, I have principles. I'm a highly principled person. What is it? Look out for number one, which isn't exactly the most moral argument we've ever seen, but it's a great little vignette of sometimes how kids think about morality and a great example of Calvin and Hobbes. So I want to start off today with my all-time favorite story. You might have seen the play. You might have seen the movie that came out in 2012 with Hugh Jackman and Russell Crowe. It was a musical. It's a really famous story that was written a long time ago, and it's incredibly popular. Like I said, there's a play and movies. There's been a lot of money put into this story, and it's been super popular. But the two big themes of this story are different perspectives on morality and grace. So the story is set in France during the 19th century, during some of the attempts to get the French Revolution going. Yes, I'm glad people love it too. It's a fantastic story. And the story parallels the journey of two different men and the way these men live out morality in very, very different ways. And they have different perspectives on it. The main character is named Jean Valjean's, Hugh Jackman's character. And the story picks up when he's released from prison after 19 years. And he was in prison because he stole a loaf of bread. So 20 years, later rebellion, thank you. It's later rebellion in the 1830s. But Jean Valjean spent 19 years in prison, and then he essentially gets out of prison a bitter, angry man, willing to do whatever it takes to survive. And shortly after being released from prison, he has a life-changing experience where someone essentially saves him from going back to prison. And this changes the essence of who he is. And the story follows the rest of his journey as he consistently puts others before himself and tries to live out the morality of, I believe others have value, and try to care for others, and he saves many lives. His journey is contrasted with Javert, who is a French policeman. And he is an accomplished man who prides himself on his morality and said, I am an absolute moral figure in society. The letter of the law is important. And he chases Jean Valjean across for 2 decades of the story. So his idea, you see these two conflicting ideas. Jean Valjean says morality is caring about others and recognizing others have value and saving other individuals and making the world a better place. Javert considers it as following the letter of the law. The law is morality. So some of the questions this story brings up, these are just 5. It brings up a lot of moral questions. But the idea is, should you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family? Should you call the police on someone who steals from you? Is it okay to help others by lying about who you are? Some of the things we're going to talk about today. So this story, if you haven't listened to, there's a great 3-hour audiobook on it. If you haven't listened to the story or even see the musical, I would highly recommend it. It's very, very good. There's actually a new BBC version out. From 2019, they made a 6-part miniseries about it that's really good as well. And yes, I would highly recommend the musical. Anne Hathaway, Amanda Seyfried, Hugh Jackman, amazing. They're awesome. So what you'll find from this is that this story sort of fits the conclusion of our lecture, is that, I'll tell you the end at the beginning. Morality is really complex. People have different perspectives on it, and it's very, very contextually based, right? We have factors like time, like your proximity to individuals, about who is there. All of this matters in morality, all right? So what is morality? Morality isn't necessarily this simple. Again, recommending more movies. If you haven't seen Emperor's New Groove, it's fantastic, but there's this goofy character who gets his shoulder angel and shoulder devil. And a lot of times when people are faced with moral decisions, we think of this, right? You have an evil side, you have a good side, and they debate and you decide what to do. But morality isn't often that simple. It's really complex. And just like our other lectures on emotion and self-regulation, attachment, I saw the comment wrong lever. That's amazing. But morality is much more complex. There's a lot more that goes into it. So let's start with the big areas of focus in developmental literature regarding morality. The first area we think of in morality research and literature is cognition. This is looking at our explicit concepts of right and wrong. What rules do we have about what is right behavior and what is wrong behavior? Think of things like stealing or lying, that we consider cognitively this is a right thing or this is a wrong thing. We also see reasoning about the right courses of action from a cognitive perspective. This can be seen as processing within individuals. We do this across our development. So in preschoolers, we have things like sharing is caring. And we try to get these lessons across to kids, and kids think about these things. Is it right to share my toys? Well, in a lot of contexts, yes. Then in elementary and middle school, you might see things like bullying. If I see someone getting bullied, do I need to step in? Is that the right course of action in this situation? And then maybe later, high school, college, older, we might see risky behavior in a peer and decide, should we do something? Should we not? Is it damaging them? So you see a cognitive reasoning about what the right course of action is with moral issues. And a lot of the role of adults in these situations are to help scaffold these situations with kids and help them process. We also see in the cognition piece the biases that influence moral thinking. What biases are moral thinking? Perhaps culture, family values, perhaps our position in society, perhaps even our perspective on moral issues like political perspectives. We see complex issues like abortion biased by what we use to make those decisions and our thinking. So that's the cognition piece. Let's go to affect. So we just talked about emotions and self-regulation last week. I love that this comes right after that. But affect in moral development literature are things like guilt, emotions, and distress. This ties back into our regulation as well, and feeling the consequences of what happens. So for instance, we might see in preschoolers, going on the idea of sharing, if I steal a toy from a friend, perhaps I don't feel bad about that as a preschooler, right? I'm just like, well, I got the toy, that's fine. But adults work with you and say, hey, that made your friend feel bad and they're really sad and it's not good for you to do these things. Then by the time you're in elementary school, if you steal a friend's toy, you might feel guilt, or you might feel empathy or sadness. So these develop. So the affect side of morality is feelings like guilt. It's also predicting the emotional consequences for yourself or for other people's. So a lot of times for me personally, you guys, I don't know if you experience this too, but this is actually worse than the consequences. Trying to think through, you know, if I mess up my brother's room or do something mean, I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna get in so much trouble and they're gonna be so sad and I'm gonna feel bad. You get this little emotional thing spinning, but predicting those emotional consequences. When I worked in a middle school classroom with kids with behavioral issues, we had one kid who had a really, really tough day. Essentially, this kid was on a very strict diet because his mom was trying to treat his ADHD through diet. So she took him off medication and was doing this very strict diet. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to us, the night before class, he went to a friend's event and gorged himself on sugar for the first time in like 6 months. So he came to school feeling awful, feeling upset, and something triggered him, and he physically attacked our teacher. And we have 3 teachers in the room. So he physically attacked her, and we calmed the situation down, and he was waiting in the classroom, and because he physically attacked a teacher, we had to call the police. And then he had to talk to the police, and he was terrified. A different teacher sat with him and he was saying, I am so scared. I know what's going to happen. I know I'm going to feel fear when I tell my mom, sadness when I talk to the policeman, anger about what happened, and then I let myself do that. So this child was predicting the emotional consequences of talking to the police, of his actions. And it turned out okay. I will tell you that. He talked to the policeman, he was suspended, and then he was doing better by the end of the year. Now note that predicting emotional consequences isn't necessarily negative. Consequences are an addition to. So this could be something positive. So as a moral individual, if I say, I think it's moral to volunteer in our society, so I decide to volunteer at a local animal shelter, I can predict that I'm going to feel good about myself afterward, right? I'm going to feel good from that volunteering because I think it's a moral act. So I can say that that's me predicting the emotional consequences, a positive one, of volunteering. Then we go to behavior. So this is behavior that derives from our moral development. And how do we act in moral situations? So when you face a moral dilemma, a few of which you'll face in class today, how do we act? So again, going back to Les Mis, stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family. That is a moral dilemma. Do you let your family starve or do you steal, essentially? Another thing is, do you judge others? Do you judge others based on their morality? A lot of our behaviors, and if we trust other individuals, are based on judgments of their morality. And then it looks at facing temptations to lie. I think this behavior is the best example of the shoulder angel devil with Kronk. How do you face temptation? How do you deal with that temptation to lie and cheat in class or in other situations or steal? We're going to look at pretty soon, in a couple slides, we're going to look at what that looked like in children. All right, so those are the main big areas in the developmental literature that we talk about when we're looking at morality and what we generally use to study morality. It's the foundation for what we're going to look at today. So again, the traditional approach is to think about moral emotion, moral reasoning, which is cognition, and then moral behavior. Okay, so we're going to face our first moral dilemma. And I have a poll. We're going to do this in a poll. So I don't know if you guys have done this example before, but it's called the Hitler age example. All right, so I want everybody to vote. And the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is this. So Hitler was an awful person, did terrible things, and he is considered one of the worst men in history. He was responsible for the death of millions, took over most of Europe. Terrible, terrible guy. So here's the moral dilemma. You know history and you're a time traveler. You know everything that's happened, same knowledge you have now. If you could go back in time and a week before Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, get a sniper rifle from half a mile away and you knew you could hit him, right? You wouldn't have consequences and you knew that if you killed Hitler, it would stop everything that happens afterward. It would fundamentally change World War II. Every bad thing he did. Here's the question. Would you take the sniper rifle and shoot Hitler? And so feel free to vote on the poll. Okay, waiting for a few more votes to come in. We're at 90%. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, so it looks like we have about 73% of people would shoot Hitler, snipe him from a distance, but 27% would not. And usually in class, we'd have a discussion about why would you go either way? Perhaps killing in general is just wrong and we shouldn't kill Hitler. Perhaps knowing what he's going to do and that he's going to be a bad guy, we shouldn't shoot Hitler. There are a lot of different debates about it. Okay, so we're at 73% and 27%. Oops. Okay, so now the next stage. Okay, so you have Hitler, 73% said they would shoot him. Now the situation is different. You have to time travel to when Hitler is 16 years old, and you have to shoot him with a revolver at point blank range. All right, so you have to shoot him when he's 16 years old. Now here's the question. Would you shoot 16-year-old Hitler at point blank range?
all the prior conditions still
Okay,
apply.
we'll wait a little bit longer. Got about 90%. A few more seconds. Okay, 95% voted. Can you guys see the results of the poll? It's not showing me if you can. No? Oh, okay. Now I'll share the results. So it's now 40% said yes, I would shoot Hitler at point blank range when he's 16 years old, and 60% said no. Yes, assuming all prior conditions apply, same thing, same result. So now we see a majority of people would not shoot Hitler. And we've had these conversations before in class with, okay, well, when you're 16, perhaps you have the potential to change. In this example, no, Hitler's going to stay the same. Perhaps point blank range is different. Does it matter how close you are to them, to the person that you might kill? Sniping is a lot different from shooting someone at point blank range. All right. So now stage 3. Stop sharing. So now stage 3. And this is where it gets brutal, not baby Hitler. Hitler's 4 years old and you have a knife and you have to kill Hitler with a knife. Would you kill Hitler with a knife? Okay, we got about 87%. Got a few more. Yes, Jacob, you're sure he's Hitler. You know you're a time traveler. You know exactly what's going to happen. Okay, so now I'll share the results. So it looks like about 79% said, no, I would not kill young 4-year-old Hitler with a knife, and 21% said yes. So we see basically a complete flip where it was 73% would kill him with a sniper's adult, and now 79% would not kill him at 4 years old with a knife. This is a brutal example, and it looks like Dana was saying there's a card game based on this idea or this discussion. What this is meant to illustrate is that there's some interesting things that influence our morality. Things like, do we believe people have the potential to change? And there's a lot of evidence that proximity and the actions you take in that moral act really, really matter. We're going to do another thing towards the end of lecture looking at a trolley. But it's the idea of, is there a difference between being physically distanced from someone and having to kill them versus a knife? It's a little bit different. With a knife, you're going to face much different things. So morality is contextually based, and it's very complicated. Okay, so now let's dive into a little bit of the history about moral development reasoning. Oh, like many other subjects, the first dude to look at it was Freud, and looking at it as the superego. And then in the 1930s, Hartshorne and May did some experiments on character. There was a lot of questions about people's character and whether or not we have good character. Hartshorne and May looked at that. And then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Jean Piaget's theory about how children develop morally. We're going to review a lot of his work. And this is the early stuff, the initial stuff on moral development. Then we got into the 60s and 70s where Kohlberg built on Piaget's work. I'll be honest, the first 2 years I studied Kohlberg, I called him Colbert because of the late night show host guy, but it's Kohlberg, and he built on Piaget's work and developed another stage theory we're going to look at today. And then finally, the more recent work is where Smetana and Nucci took an approach on moral cognition, looking at more the cognitive piece of morality. And then Eisenberg and others started looking at moral emotion and moral behavior. That's where we get those 3 pillars of moral behavior. And then finally, Paul Bloom's work now is looking at the morality of babies. So we're going to start with Piaget and Hartshorne, then look at Kohlberg, Smetana, and then spend some time talking about morality in babies. So the earliest studies on character. By the way, do tell me again if you need me to slow down or anything. That's completely fine. I want you to be able to take the notes that you need to take. So Hartshorne and May were really, really interested in honesty in children. So the idea was, would children commit moral misdemeanors, and when and with who? Do adults matter? Do they not matter? So what they did was they gave young children the opportunity to cheat. So for example, they created a situation where they had kids come into a room and they said, we want you to write numbers within circles on a page, but you have to keep your eyes closed. By the way, we're going to leave the room. So you're going to be completely alone. So it essentially gave the kids the opportunity to cheat. And then the kids were told that you receive a prize if you succeed on the task. All right. So this is very, very similar to the marshmallow experiment that we watched last week. What we saw last week was some kids would like scrape the top of the marshmallow and eat a little bit and set it down thinking the adult's not here, I'll get away with it, then I can taste the marshmallow. Other kids would lick it and set it back down. So it's a similar idea. Generally what they found was that most children cheated. It was a common transgression, but it was very, very based on the situation. So you see the varying here is really, really based on contextual factors. So if a researcher stayed in the room, or maybe if a friend was present, or if they didn't perceive that the prize was worth cheating. You know, if it's a big prize, maybe they're definitely going to cheat, and not as good of a prize, they're not going to cheat. So we see that there's some evidence that kids do things like cheating. And Piaget continued this work by looking at children's concepts of rules. A lot of times we equate morality with following rules, right? So what Piaget did was he observed children playing games like marbles. You can't tell it's a while ago because we don't really play marbles anymore, but he would observe kids playing games like marbles and other ones, and he looked across the ages. He focused mostly on kids 10 and under, but he looked in depth across those. And then he would ask them questions about how they played. All right, so they'd say like, where do rules come from? You know, does everyone have to follow the rules? And can these rules change? So one thing to note, he mostly observed white middle-class kids during the 30s, 40s, that age, right? So let's review his stages of moral development. So he spent hundreds of hours watching kids play games, interacting with them, answering questions, and he compiled all his observations and developed and published this theory. He said, when we're developing morally, first we're in the pre-moral stage. This is the first few years of life, usually 0 to 3 years old. In this stage of life, children are often unaware of socially defined rules. So kids may take a friend's marbles, or walk away in the middle of the game, or rig the game so they can win. They're not really aware of these socially defined things. In life, this looks like things like little kids don't really understand that during circle time, they need to stay quiet in class, right? They have to learn to wait their time to talk, or to share, or to ask a question. He also observed that there's not a systematic intent to win, and that kids really derive pleasure from playing the game, taking turns. It's not necessarily found in winning. So kids play to play for their own personal enjoyment, not to win. That's why they may steal things, why they might not work specifically towards that goal of winning. Then we move to the heteronomous morality stage. Piaget talked about these as about ages 4 to 7, right? And in this, children now had to have developed a clear respect for rules, all right? So this would look like kids not cheating anymore, or walking away, or stealing their friends' toys just because they want them. In life, kids also do things like they sit in their seats, they clean up their space, they might raise their hand to ask the teacher a question, and they view rules as stemming from authority figures. And there are a lot of different authority figures they can see here, which you have a few examples of on the slide. They also see that rules are unchangeable, that this is the rule, this is how it is, and it doesn't change across contexts. This is just the way it is. So Kids will say the rules of the game as unchangeable. You might read them the rules to something like Candyland, and those are the rules. You have to follow them. And following the rules is good, breaking the rules is bad. There's an amazing viral video from a few years ago where it has these two really young kids, probably 3.5 to 4 years old. And the kids are in a passionate debate with each other. One is saying, "My mommy said it's raining outside." And the other girl says, "Well, my mommy says it's sprinkling." And they literally argue for about 3 minutes passionately on this subject, because for them, sprinkling and raining are completely different things. It's a very cute video. I highly recommend it. But it's this idea with the rules are unchangeable. It is one or the other. There's no variation. And they often don't consider the intention of those involved, right? So that's really, really important about the heteronomous stage. Your intention doesn't matter to me. All that matters is the outcome, right? So if you break the rules accidentally because you've never played the game before and you're learning, that doesn't matter. You still cheated. In another situation in life, you could see kids where if they protect a friend who's getting bullied and hit the bully, that doesn't matter. They still hit someone, and that's not okay. So kids in these stages, it's a little more black and white of like, rules are good, not following them is bad. It doesn't matter what your intention is. So that's ages 4 to about 7. And then you get to the autonomous third stage of Piaget's theory. This is around ages 8 to 9 years old. This has to do, it's characterized by increasing relativism. So now that kids are recognizing, okay, so morality is influenced by the time I live in, the culture I live in, and the society I live in. So for example, we have rules and laws existing today that we didn't have in the past. Things like child labor laws. 100, 150 years ago, it was very normal for children to work 40-hour weeks in a very long time. But our society has deemed that immoral, and now we have child labor laws where children legally can't work that much. Then these kids also view rules as socially constructed and therefore open to challenge. So think about transportation across our nation. We have the goal of making sure that people can walk, bike, ride a train, drive, fly, where they need to, right? But if we didn't have any rules about how transportation happened, we couldn't have that much, because cars could go whatever speed they wanted and people could walk wherever they wanted. So we've set up rules for how you transport yourself across the US. And one of the consequences of that is a rule is don't speed in your car, right? So if you do speed, you'll face punishment or consequences. So usually that's a financial punishment, or you have to attend some kind of seminar, something like that. But let's be honest, all of us go 5 miles over the speed limit, don't we? I know for me, I tend to go about 5 miles over because I know I can get away with it, because this is a socially constructed rule. It's a part of the social contract. But I actually knew in high school, my favorite place to go for lunch was Panda Express when I could afford it, but it was really far away. So I figured out that if I drive 7 miles over the speed limit, I could get there and back during the lunch hour in high school. Completely ridiculous, yes, but I knew that this rule was a little more malleable and I challenged it a little bit. The other thing kids in the autonomous morality stage realize is that rules can be changed, but only with the agreement of others. So you can't change a rule alone, but if you want to change something, you can talk to a group of individuals. This can look like things like maybe in the transportation, there's an area where it's unsafe for pedestrians to walk and we really need a crosswalk. So you can go to your local government and ask for that. Perhaps they'll ask you for things like a petition and having people sign. So that's the agreement of others. So they recognize that. This is where it gets more complex too, because in the autonomous stage, kids recognize that breaking a rule in service of a larger good is acceptable. So the intentions at this point really, really matter, all right? And that means that the punishment should fit the crime. So can you do the wrong thing for the right reasons? There's a lot of movies and literature that focuses on this. And actually, there's a lot of movies around this age that are catered to kids around 8 to 9 years old that focus on that as well. And so the big shift here is that while in the heteronomous stage, they focus on outcomes, here there's a clear focus on the intentions, right?
Bethany, there was one question.
All right, so let's go back to our Les Mis example. So Jean Valjean, Hugh Jackman's character again, tends to break the rules for the larger good. So he tends to try to help others by breaking the rules. So they would say based on Piaget's standards, he's in the autonomous stage. And for Javert, in contrast, the rules are unchangeable, and he actually had a whole song talking about the letter of the law and living by the letter of the law. So he's more in the heteronomous stage. So I want to give you an illustration of what this looks like. So as children develop through the pre-moral and the different stages across development, we see a shift from the focus on those outcomes to the focus on the attention. So please take about 45 seconds to read through these two examples.
Bethany, can you hear me now?
I'll give you a chance to keep reading through that, but it seems like I'm not hearing people when they're asking questions. Perhaps my volume was off. Can somebody ask a question now?
Can you hear us now?
Didn't hear anything. Okay, can someone ask something now?
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, okay, thank you. I can hear you now. What's up?
There was a question. So I think this was for the intentions part in the last slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Does this recognize differences in how authority figures treat people across cultures, class, race, etc.?
Oh yes, Maggie, that's a great question. No, it does not. One of the huge criticisms of Piaget's work is that it was very narrowly constructed. Again, he primarily focused on observing white middle-class kids and only children. So it really doesn't account for variations very well. And that's a huge weakness of this theory. Any other questions I missed?
I think that was the only one on chat.
Okay, cool. Well, if you have any, it's definitely, my volume's definitely working now, so feel free to ask a question. So you saw on these are two different examples of a little boy named John who accidentally breaks 15 cups and another kid who breaks 1 cup. And if you look at kids in the heteronomous stage, they focus on the outcomes. And what you see is they would say something along the lines of, John broke the cups, therefore he should be punished. That's just the end of the story. In the autonomous phase, Henry didn't mean to break the cups. It was an accident, so he shouldn't be punished. All right, so we see that transition from outcomes to intentions in young kids. So as I said, the sampling for this, people said, oh, this isn't that great. And the other big issue is that Piaget was kind of like, okay, at 9, we are all perfectly moral people. We're fully developed. It's all good. That's not exactly true. We keep developing morally throughout our lives. And that was a huge flaw in his theory, is that he assigned it to specific ages. So in the 60s, Kohlberg took this and said, okay, I like the idea of stages, but I'm not really sure that we're capturing all of moral development across the lifespan, right? We don't just develop as kids, we develop longer than that. So Kohlberg revolutionized moral development building on Piaget's idea, and he updated it essentially. What he did was he gave children moral dilemmas, again, mostly white males. He gave them moral dilemmas that involved a choice between obeying a law, a person, a rule, or breaking that in order to help others. And he had a couple different types of examples that he shared with kids, and we're going to go over one today. So essentially, he was the forerunner to the show What Would You Do? All right, so we're going to watch the Heinz dilemma. He began by showing participants a classic moral dilemma.
Mrs. Wyke is dying because of a special kind of cancer. There's only one drug that the doctors think might save her. It is a new formula which a pharmaceutical company in the same town has recently discovered. The drug is very expensive to produce, but the company is charging 10 times the production cost. Heinz goes to everyone he knows to borrow money, but he can only collect half of what the drug costs. He tells the CEO of the company that his wife is dying and asks him to sell it for less so he could pay at a later time. But the CEO refuses. He can make no exceptions. The research has been very expensive and the company needs to turn in a profit. What should happen next?
Okay, I have a poll on this one. So what should Heinz do? What would he say? Okay, waiting for a few more people. We're almost there. All right, so it looks like 50% of people said Heinz should steal the drug and not go to prison, as this is unfair. 19% said Heinz should not steal the drug since he would be breaking the law. And 31% said Heinz should steal the drug and accept that should say any consequences. So essentially what we see is a relative split here. And Heinz used these, or Freud used these to determine where kids were at in the stages of his development. Also, I loved your guys' comments about peer-reviewed journals at 10 years old and how you were perfectly moral at that age, of course. That's fantastic. Okay. So Kohlberg would then ask them probes, which are essentially follow-up questions, to look at their rationale, like why are they making these decisions? So he asked them questions like, does the individual have an obligation to steal the drug? Do you have actually an obligation to do this? Then should he have stolen the drug even if it was for a stranger? So does it matter that it's his wife for the moral dilemma in this question? And also, is it morally wrong to break the law by stealing? So he asked them these probing questions to get at their motivation and then used those to form his theory. So we saw what you guys said. Let's see what some kids say in response to the moral dilemma. And while you're watching these, I'm going to ask you a few questions afterward. So first, observe what you think the ages of the kids are and the key phrases they say. What do you observe about their reactions? And do you think they struggled with the decisions they made? So we're going to watch two videos because one has a bit of an older kid too.
The basis of children's reasoning and judgments about moral decisions changes over time. Children between the ages of 6 and 10 tend to judge acts as unilaterally right or wrong. focusing on rules and consequences. Intentions are often neglected.
I'm going to read you a story now, and then I'm going to ask you some questions after I read the story, okay? Are you ready? Okay.
Let me skip the story.
Druggists had discovered a possible woman or her husband could afford. So Hines, the sick woman's husband, then borrowed all the money and asked him to sell the drug cheaper or to let him pay later. The druggist replied, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." Hines then became desperate and broke into the store to steal the drug for his wife. Should Hines have stolen the drug? No. No? No? No. No.
Moral decisions at this age are made at the pre-conventional or conventional level and reflect.
Maria, they asked him, should Hines steal the drug? Should he have stolen the drug?
Either a punishment reward orientation or the desire to obey rules and conform to social norms.
Why is it wrong? Because you never know if somebody's hiding where police are close, and there are maybe police or spies sneak in there. Because stealing could turn you into a criminal. Because you might get caught. You'll be sent to jail. Even though she was going to die, that doesn't give him a right to steal. No, even though that his wife was in desperate need, it still isn't right to steal.
In middle childhood, children are only beginning to question the absolute nature of laws and rules and consider the impact of intentions on moral decisions.
Was it actually right or wrong to have stolen the drug? I can see why he would do it, but I don't think it's right. Well, it wasn't okay, lawfully, but, it's better than somebody dying. I would say yes, because he probably cares about his wife a lot, and he doesn't want her to die, anything, and I would say no, because it's not good to steal.
Okay, we're gonna watch one other video.
Think Hines should steal the drug?
I guess so, yeah.
You think so? And why do you think he should steal the drug?
Well, based upon the fact that it's immoral that the first guy is charging so much, I mean, there's absolutely no other way around it. I'm sure he could, well, I guess you said he couldn't think of another way, so, yeah, I guess that's the only, that's what I do, is the only option.
Okay, because the guy was immoral in the first place.
Yeah, I guess.
And do you think it's important for people to do everything they can to save another's life?
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, and why do you think that?
Because life is valuable,
Mhm.
it's a lot more important than money. Yeah, there's lots of important.
Okay, and
Okay, so you see a few examples of how kids of different ages respond to the Heinz dilemma. So, by the way, this chat is awesome. I love it. I agree. After the debate yesterday, this is a great conversation and I appreciate it. What did you observe in the kids? Obviously, there were different ages. So, what did you observe about the kids? Did they struggle with their decision? What key phrases did you hear?
I mean, most of them, like I think in the first video at least, like said like no, like just straight up were like very confidently said no. But I think in like the second video, the first like kid we saw like really explained himself. So I think like you saw like as they got kind of older, I think they had more of an explanation as to why, whereas like the younger kids were kind of just like, this is my answer, and like didn't really like always say why, I guess, is kind of like something that I personally noticed, I think. Which I guess like makes sense, right? Because like as they get like into the older stages of like development, like they actually have like reasoning, but right? Like, don't they have like more reasoning behind it, or like they understand more? I think like what kind of like we were saying.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Absolutely. Is it's more complex, and maybe they're even seeing themselves more in Heinz, that ability to like see if I was in this scenario, maybe it would be this way. And yeah, the younger kids were very confident, as some of you guys are saying in the chat, very focused on outcomes. And there's a lot of conversations in the younger kids, like the first one who said, authority. This rule is stemming from authority, and they will punish me if I don't follow this, like polices and stuff. Yeah. Other observations? Yeah, Jacob, that's a good point. The older kids have more social knowledge too, social intelligence. Emotional development is a lot different then. The 16-year-old mumbled a little bit, but it was more of a dialogue with the researcher and a longer conversation of what that looks like for sure. So we see that kids move to more understanding Heinz's perspective, more complex thinking, moving from that black and white and looking at authority figures to more complex, saying, well, this isn't really fair. So it was an interesting study, and it's been used across time. And this is what he used to develop his theory, basically. He did the same thing as Piaget. He asked kids a bunch of questions, compiled all of it, and developed this theory. And so he developed a stage theory, similar to Piaget, with a few updates. You'll notice one key difference is these aren't attached to a particular age. They're just stages, all right? And so what he developed was 3 levels, each of which have a different stage. And then each stage is increasingly complex. So as you go through, you get more complex in your moral development, all right? So in the first pre-conventional stage, the first step is what is rewarded is right and what is punished is wrong, all right? So again, the focus is on the outcomes, not the intent. So in the kids, we see that they say, well, you get punished for stealing a drug, therefore it must be bad. You get rewarded for what's doing right. So in the Heinz dilemma, someone at the stage would say, Heinz should not steal the medicine because he'll go to prison. The second stage looks at what is good for me is good for you. And that's the idea of the reciprocity of needs. So what serves me serves you. If you get rewarded in class, I may get rewarded in class. So a lot of times we say that teachers reward the whole class. So for instance, teachers might say, if you do well, if everyone does well on their sticker chart or like their weather chart, we'll reward the whole class, right? So in this example, a kid would say something like, Heinz should steal because he will be really happy if he saves his wife's life. So he'll be happy because she's better. Then we move to the conventional stage, conventional morality stage, and that is what is good is socially approved. So the intentions at this stage and meaning well matter. So again, we just moved from outcomes being important to intentions being important. So someone would say something like, Heinz should steal because he will be viewed as a good husband in this case. This also is encouraged by adults by the fact that kids are usually verbally rewarded for things like sharing with a friend. I mean, I've been around preschoolers or toddlers where they love, they share something with a friend, and then all the adults go, ooh, this is amazing. I love that. Oh yeah, so I can go back in 1 second. I'm gonna finish explaining this one. So in this stage, if an infant shares or a kid shares, all the adults around them go, oh, you're so good, this is great, you're such a nice friend. And they're learning, I'm getting social approval for sharing with my friend, therefore sharing must be good. I'm gonna go back 1 slide really quick. Okay. So the stage 4, which is the second part of conventional morality, is that morality means following the rules of society, all right? Laws and rules maintain order and thus should be obeyed. So the theory is we wouldn't have order without rules. Going back to that transportation example, Transportation, we need to get across the US or across different places, and we follow the rules because otherwise transportation would fall apart. So in this case, a student would say something like, Heinz should steal because it is his duty as a husband to save his wife, but if he gets caught, he should be ready to accept the consequences for breaking the rules. I think it's interesting that they said if he gets caught. That's really fascinating. These are actual quotes from kids who have done the study across the years. Then we go to post-conventional morality, right? And this is stage 5, which says laws, oh yeah, I'll go back. So laws that are fair and maximize social welfare should be followed. All right, so this is the law fair? If it maximizes benefits for others, these should be followed. So in this case, a child might say, everyone has the right to be alive regardless of what the law says. So there is a consideration beyond just, oh, society rewards me for following this, but saying, wow, is that fair? Is our society fair? And then the last stage that Kohlberg developed was moral decisions are made on the basis of abstract moral principles. So this is like super philosophy, where it's like the abstract moral ideas that govern our life. And an example of this would be like preserving human life is a higher moral obligation than preserving property, right? So we get to very, very more abstract thinking of morality. So I'll give you a second to write down the notes on this one.
Yeah, I actually sort of had like a question to pose. So, you know, a lot of people have firearms at home, particularly because of fears of home invasion, even though statistically, like, you know, you'd have to have like a loaded gun next to you just ready to go, like just in case. So it's like not feasible for a lot of people. But a question that I was posed only recently was like, does someone who's stealing my TV deserve to die? Like, so that's, I guess, kind of like a question that even though, you know, Kohlberg says, oh, well, by this point in development, you understand that there's a higher obligation to protect life than like steal property. Like, that's a situation where so many people would think, yeah, I'll shoot someone if they try to steal my property, but like, do they really deserve to die when you think about it? So interesting question.
I think it's a really, really good question for looking at these stages. Yeah, absolutely. Because it might say that like morality means following the rules of society. And if the rules of society are protect my property, and that's the law, maybe that's okay, right? But then some of these greater ones are saying, you know what, that's not maximizing social welfare. So it is looking at different stages of moral development, basically. Kohlberg would put the reaction to that. I mean, you could probably map out how people would respond to that based on this theory. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, great question, Jacob. We're going to talk about that in a second. Did everyone get notes on this? Myra, I haven't watched Tiger King, but I've heard it's amazing. So yeah. So going back to the Les Mis example, again, Valjean says that he looks at laws that are fair to maximize social welfare, essentially to help others. So he's in the post-conventional phase of moral development. And then Javert is more conventional in the conventional phase because he says laws and rules maintain order and thus should be obeyed. There's a part in the story, for instance, where Jean Valjean lies about who he is to be mayor of a town and help other people. And then in contrast, Javert, towards the end of the story, faces a moral dilemma where he feels like the law does not adequately cover morality. And it really, really, he struggles with it to the point of the detriment of his own character, to who he is. I don't want to give away any spoilers, though. So let's look at a developmental perspective of this. So we don't have it attached to specific ages, but Kohlberg did look at this in different ages to say, maybe how do these stages develop? So what we have here is the percentage of reasoning, which is a little abstract, but how much they were reasoning within a given area. and then different ages right here. All right, so what they did is they mapped how much each stage was present at people at different ages. So here's stage 1, the first stage. They saw, oh, in 10 years old it's present, and then it really drops off and stays down. And then you get stage 2, which is also even more present at 10 years old, and you see it drop down like this. And you see these trends where then you say stage 3 is pretty low, it develops around 16, 18, and then it starts to drop down. And then at 10 years old, 4 isn't really present, but it slowly develops to around 24, 26 years old, and then kind of goes up from there. Interesting thing to note about both of these. Number 1, stage 5 is really low. It just is low the whole time. And then stage 6 is not here. What they found is that Kohlberg actually had to drop stage 6 eventually from his theory because it wasn't supported. A lot of people weren't in stage 6, so it's definitely a flaw. So let's talk about some of the problems with this theory. The later stages of development were rarely found among people in traditional or rural communities. So we see a researcher who's used white, middle class, predominantly male samples, applying this to other individuals and finding that it doesn't really stand up. So yes, white men, middle class, and he eventually had to drop the level 6 because it hardly ever was present. Another view was that how he saw this developed. He said, you know what, I think it's a steady upward march like you're walking upstairs. So he doesn't consider context at all. It doesn't matter. He just says you move forward. So when you reach a higher stage, you're less likely to reason at a lower stage, all right? So you can't go back, you just go forward, all right? So he doesn't consider context. If someone moves to a different context, their morality changes, and he didn't recognize that at all. And he considered a very narrow context within his theory itself. So if you think about the movie 12 Years a Slave, which is fantastic, I just watched it for the first time a couple weeks ago, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. You see a character go from 2 very different contexts, where it's the true story of a Black man who was kidnapped. He was a free man in the North, and he was kidnapped. People lied and said he was a slave, and he was put in bondage for 12 years. And the movie brings up moral questions, and it kind of talks about these different contexts he was in and how he has to make different decisions at those stages. All right. So I'm going to go add a request to go back. So I'm going to go back really quick.
When was Kohlberg's theory produced, whatever it's called?
Yeah, he developed it primarily in the 60s. So Piaget was like 30s, 40s, and then Kohlberg took it and developed it in the 60s. All right, so again, this is what we've talked about, the cross-cultural research on Kohlberg. Now people have taken this theory and tried it all over the world and tried to apply it to a lot of different contexts. So the next couple slides are based on a 1985 article. And by 1985, this article looked at 45 studies that applied Kohlberg's theory to places all over the world. So Kohlberg based his original claim on children in the US, Taiwan, Turkey, urban Mexico, and rural Mexico. So he basically observed primarily white children and adults, and then in the US context, and then he studied a few other places and made his theory, all right? So since then, like I said, it's been widely used. What they've found over time is that the Heinz dilemma is a really good example of moral development in a specific context. The meaning of supplying drugs, this situation, means a lot of different things across cultures, like the marshmallow study we looked at last week. So one of the interesting things with the marshmallow study is that they've looked at this across different contexts. One of the ones they did is they did the marshmallow test with refugee children. And what they found was that no kids waited for the second marshmallow because they were experiencing significant food insecurity. Why would you wait to have a marshmallow that may come when you could have this one now? So the Heinz dilemma doesn't always translate across cultures. And we do see variations in Kohlberg's theory across cultures. So for instance, in the US, we tend to be a guilty, innocent society, where that's what we focus on, partially because of the individualistic nature. But other societies are very honor-shame cultures. If you think about how that applies to moral development, that really may change something how you view the Heinz dilemma. So in this article with Snary, they found that they looked at all these different studies and concluded that Kohlberg's model can work as long as it's adapted to the specific culture in two key ways. The first way is that the dilemmas need to be adapted with cultural considerations, okay? So in some cultures, they adapted it from stealing a drug to stealing food, or they changed the relationship. They did, I think, 3 different studies. The Heinz dilemma is one of them. The other thing they found that was really, really important is to talk about the experiment or the dilemma in the person's native language. So it got rid of a language barrier, really, really helps with how they run this study. So generally, they found that the stages 1 through 4 were evidenced across cultures, all right? But stage 5 was rare in general. It was especially rare among all folk cultural groups. So it was more present in urban and middle class populations, but not as common across folk cultural groups. Why would that be? Well, the social systems we live in differ in their level, all right? So some of these things like stealing a drug might be a lot more prevalent in one situation than another situation. So the other problem is that Kohlberg, it's like taking a theory from one part of the world and applying it to another. Maybe the theory works, but is it capturing everything that moral development is in the new culture, right? So Kohlberg's work doesn't capture cultural values like collective solidarity, things like that are more prevalent in other cultures. The other thing it might not capture is that the relationships, for instance, between children and parents is a lot different across cultures. How you treat your parents, what that looks like. I personally have 2 grandmothers. Both my grandmothers are in assisted living homes, and it's culturally appropriate to put your grandparents in homes here, assisted living homes. But that may not be as appropriate in other cultures if the relationship between parents and children is different. So we miss some of these things in the theory. So there's a lot of new research. As I said, a lot of the research started with Piaget and Kohlberg, and there's more stuff out there now looking at, okay, so how is moral development affected by culture? And I would highly recommend this Weinrib article from 2006. They summarize a lot of different work on this and have a huge conversation about culture. It's a fantastic piece. So I highly recommend it. I can provide it to anyone who wants it. In this article, they define culture as a multifaceted environment offering opportunities for diverse kinds of social interactions. And we're going to go through this slide and then take our break. So cultures are a multifaceted environment offering opportunities for diverse kinds of social interactions. So essentially, people are embedded in their culture, and this culture has practices and traditions that are unique, right? And we develop over time within those. So this recognizes that you are an active part of your own development. You have a specific environment based on your culture, but you also play an active role in that. You have had a lot of opportunities to engage with that culture, and you've chosen what you would like to engage, right? So I remember as a kid, Thanksgiving was a part of the culture I grew up with. It was just a normal thing. And it wasn't until I read Harry Potter that I realized it was an American tradition. I didn't realize that Thanksgiving isn't a thing that only happens in America. I thought it was a worldwide thing because this is where I grew up and that was how I understood the world. And I was like, these poor British children in this story, they don't get Thanksgiving break, you know, but they got other breaks. So that was my example of realizing like, oh, this is a culturally specific thing I grew up with. So what they've observed is in this and how culture affects moral development is that it varies. There's a lot of heterogeneity of moral life across cultures, and this really depends on two different factors, right? The first factor are the multiple social and moral concerns that persons across cultures develop and how they respond to those. So again, where you grow up is specific, right? So you grew up in a specific context, you had specific concerns growing up that others didn't have, and you face those while you develop. And then you choose how you respond to those. I think this is why it would be so hard to actually systematically map out development, is because we have so many things influencing us. A lot of those are based on culture. The other finding from this article is that the other important thing for how you develop morally is your power. The position you hold in society really affects your morality. It's incredibly important. So we see if you are a general in the military and have to make decisions about troops who go where, you might have a different moral perspective than someone else who doesn't have that kind of power. And we also see consequences based on your power for being moral individuals. And some of the movements we've seen recently, if you step into these movements, sometimes you have consequences for acting as a moral individual because you have less power within our society. So what we really find is that it's context dependent and that your power in society matters and it shapes your morality. So in general, the article concludes we must attempt to recognize the cultural context in which people develop, especially in the realm of moral development. Jacob, that's a really good point too, is that when you're a kid, you have a different, wouldn't you age as a kid also change? Yes, your age as a kid. We get things like, so the question was, wouldn't your age as a kid change your position in society? Absolutely. We see that in a lot of different ways. So for instance, when you transition to middle school in America, traditionally, you go from being in one classroom all day to moving between lots of different classrooms. So society is granting you more power and responsibility and autonomy, saying, we believe you are responsible enough to get yourself to class, to have a locker, organize your stuff, and to handle that responsibly. So we're giving more freedom and power to the kids. And that happens in high school when people get to go off campus and start driving. We see that in college, at different stages of life as you develop, absolutely. Yeah. All right, so it's 4:13. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and come back at 4:23, okay? Now we're going to move into the newer theory, social domain theory. All right. So with social domain theory, they said, let's get away from stage theory. You know what? Maybe moral development isn't this developmental progression, but more of a process. And they really focused on the cognitive side. And they thought, okay, it depends on the social context. Okay. So it's not that we have these moral jumps in our development, like walking up a staircase. It's more like a process, and that perhaps peers matter in this context. So Smetana did a lot of this work with 3- and 4-year-olds looking at moral versus conventional transgressions. And I'll go through what those are on the next slide. But then the big question they were wondering was, does authority matter? All right. So they wanted to investigate whether kids have an awareness of right and wrong, regardless of the rules of authority figure. So does it matter? So we saw that kids sometimes cheat when they're alone. Does that still hold true? Do kids always cheat? So Ms. Matana talked about the difference between, not popping up, there we go, moral transgressions and conventional transgressions. And the ways they differentiated the two is they asked questions about them. So their theory was like, you know what? We have these clear moral transgressions. These are really concrete and straightforward moral dilemmas. So for young kids, this is things like hitting people, shoving people, stealing, and not sharing. Hilariously, throwing water at someone was a part of their analyses as well. They thought that that was probably a big issue and a moral dilemma. So in these cases, Children who were asked about moral transgressions tended to think of these as way more serious and deserving of punishment, and they're not based on the context. It's always true that hitting is wrong or shoving is wrong. And then Smetana said, well, there's moral transgressions, but there are also other things that aren't really right or wrong. Like they're more wrong, but maybe they're not totally wrong or a moral issue. And this is how they developed conventional transgressions. So these aren't exactly moral issues, but can be less right or wrong to an extent. So this is things like not participating in class, not sitting in the right place, putting toys in the wrong place. I love wearing pajamas to school, except on pajama day. That's a good day, which is every day for us right now, let's be honest. But yeah, they asked kids about these two different scenarios. So if any of you guys have seen the old experiment on the very original Candid camera in black and white, they did an elevator experiment. And it was to look at whether people integrate into society or if they follow society's rules. And so what they did was they had all these people they hired in an elevator face the side wall of the elevator when they were inside. And they saw if the person who didn't know about the joke came into the elevator and switched and looked at the wall. So that would be like a conventional transgression. They're trying to say there's no rule about how you stand in an elevator, but can we get people to stand that way? It's a really funny experiment. So this developed into social domain theory. So Smetana said, young children view the social world as consisting of distinct domains of social rules and knowledge. And they actually found 3 domains. All right, they found the moral domain, which is concerns about universal right and wrong, that this is definitely right or wrong, things like hurting other people. Then they looked at things, they said, okay, kids recognize conventional domain, which are more arbitrary social rules. So these are things like teachers saying you have to ask me to go to the bathroom. Maybe you have a bathroom pass or something. And then the last thing is the personal domain. Kids recognized that people have individual preferences. Things like if you prefer to have music playing or not when you study. It's not really a moral issue or a conventional issue. It's just a personal preference. Okay, everyone got that? Then let's look at how this develops across time. Smetana found that in toddlers, when they talk about these different moral and conventional transgressions, toddlers recognize moral transgressions, but they don't recognize the conventional transgressions in red. In contrast, compared to adults, adults recognize the conventional transgressions and the moral transgressions. So what they see as a switch is toddlers don't really recognize these nuanced situations, but adults do. That's what they concluded in their 1984 study. So let's review really quick. So Piaget and Kohlberg viewed very young children as dependent on adult authority. But maybe that's not the question we should be asking. Smetana showed that preschoolers understand moral transgressions are wrong regardless of whether authority figures are present. So they have a sense of right and wrong. And this leads us to the social intuitionist model. So we're going to watch a video on this.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. So.
Okay. So we see another scenario kind of similar to the Heinz dilemma. The difference between these two is that this is a split-second decision. So a lot of times they would ask people, really quick, like which one would you do? Would you change the track to kill the one person instead of killing the 5? And then they change it and say, you actually have to physically push them over the bridge. And they also ask questions like, what if the one person you switch the track to is someone you love? Would you just still switch it? So they played with this idea of morality and saying it's very situational. Who's on each side of the track? Do you have to physically push someone, or do you just change something from afar? There's a lot of evidence that our moral compass idea in these situations changes based on proximity, right? So the social intuitionist model suggests that they used these to do split-second decisions to say, you know what, morality derives from intuition in a social situation first, and then logic comes into play. Then your cognitive process comes into play when you have to justify that intuition. So the social intuitionist model says, you know what? Our responses to moral situations are automatic, right? We have an automatic response saying we should do this, we should switch the track or not, and then you justify it afterward. All right, so think of a split-second decision you've had to make in the past. You might make that decision. Do you rationalize it afterward? Do you tell people why you made that decision? That was their whole theory. It's not this big developmental thing. This is what it is. So generally, another issue people started realizing with moral reasoning is it's great that we study moral reasoning, but we limit our interest to development, right? And it's a lot based on our language skills. You can't really ask a baby, all right, we have this scenario with a trolley where you have 2 tracks. Would you switch the track? Babies can't communicate with you that way. So we might actually be missing out on other aspects of morality that occur earlier. And so perhaps we come pre-equipped with some biases at the beginning, right? Maybe babies aren't just blank slates. If you've taken any of the infant classes, infant cognition with Renee in psychology, she goes over a lot of this, and she blew my mind when I took her class. She's amazing. I took it with Sinjari. This leads us to the questions of moral development in babies. So people ask, are we moral from the beginning? Do we know that there's a right and wrong from a young age? There's some great work at Yale we're going to watch on this.
Is a human baby a purely amoral creature? Just a blank slate who learns from society to respond with compassion to suffering and with outrage to unfairness and injustice? Or is it possible that a baby understands right from wrong at the very start of his or her life? There's a growing body of scientific evidence to support the idea that perhaps some sense of good and evil is bred in the bone. I am Paul Bloom, a psychology professor at Yale University, and I'm part of a team exploring the moral life of babies.
We're here at Yale University's Infant Cognition Center. This center researches what infants know about their physical worlds and their social worlds, and has been doing so for about the last 10 years. So my work here as a graduate student is what infants understand about people as good people and bad people, whether a young infant, before they're being taught about these kinds of concepts, could make distinctions like these. All right, so we'll have you sit right here with her, and then just scoot all the way up to the front of the table there. We run puppet shows in the lab.
Do something fun now, okay?
They are either hand puppets or little wooden shapes in which one character plays the role of the good guy and another character plays the role of the bad guy. Close the curtain. One puppet tries but fails to get to the top of the hill, sort of struggling and falling back down. On alternating trials, we show infants one character who comes and bumps the climbing character up the hill, and down goes the curtain. If you're ready, up goes the curtain. On another trial, we have a character who comes and bumps the character down the hill. Down goes the curtain. And up goes the curtain. infants see that interaction sort of over and over again between 6 and 14 times. After they're sort of finished looking at it, when they're nice and bored, we simply ask them to choose between the two characters. All right, great. So we are all done with that part. We're just gonna have her choose between the puppets now. That one. All right, good job. That was the helpful guy, wasn't it? Astonishingly, really, we are finding that upwards of 80% of babies are choosing the character who was helpful over the character who was unhelpful. How are you, gorgeous? Thank you. And in another of our tests is a character who has a ball, and he plays with his ball sort of happily, and then he drops his ball to one side of the stage for another. At the back of the stage, there are two characters, one of whom runs up when the ball goes over near him, grabs the ball, and gives the ball back to the character who dropped it. On the other hand, the character on the other side of the stage, when he runs up, he grabs the ball and runs off stage with it. So we are just going to have her choose between the puppets now.
That guy.
All right, so we see that infants were choosing the friend, the baby, the character who helped. With this experiment, they change which each character is. So it's not always the circle that needs help. It's not always the triangle that's the helper. They change colors. They also make the person giving the puppet or the thing to the child not know what happened in the study, which was the good one and the bad one. So they randomize this, they make sure people don't bias the babies anyway, and this is what they find. It sounds like Megan had experience in the chat actually working on this with Renee, which is awesome. She does a lot of research on moral development in babies. Yeah, we'll actually come back to variations of this experiment in a couple weeks in some other lectures because the experiment gets a little more complicated, but this was the initial step in that. Laura, do the parents' biochemical reactions potentially influence the kids' emotions? That's a good question. In a lot of this research, they have the parents close their eyes. I think in this study for the video, they didn't have them do that, but I've seen a lot of them where they have the parents wear headphones and close their eyes, but put the baby on their lap so that they can't influence them in some way. But maybe sometimes they don't. That's my understanding. Yeah, there might be prep on we're about to do something fun, how they talk to them about it, absolutely. So there's another video I would highly recommend going and watching. It's about the idea, do infants help others, right? So do they around 18 months understand when someone needs help? So it's a really goofy video. I would highly recommend it because this researcher has to act really sad and like he can't open a cabinet or he can't stack something, and they see if babies help, and they do find a lot of times babies will help them open the cabinet or something. It's hilarious because one of the babies at one point he keeps knocking over a stack of things and the baby kind of gives him a side eye like, can you really not do this, man? It's very cute. So there's also evidence that babies know to help other people even before they have some of those verbal skills. So just to summarize today, Piaget and Kohlberg provided a great groundwork, innovative and important theories about how moral reasoning develops, but there was a huge lack of thinking about context, how this looks across groups, and they underestimated children's own abilities and said that it's based on adults, basically. And social domain theory suggests that children understand morality at a much younger age and it's not determined by adult rules, and that there's a big gap between moral reasoning and moral behavior, and that this might be explained by just our moral intuition or emotion, and then we reason about it. All right, and that even infants and toddlers have a rich set of cognitive tools that help them learn how to be moral or have these moral reactions at a young age. So generally, morality is a critical step in our development and may lay an essential foundation for who we become in subsequent developmental stages. All right. So that's morality. There's a lot there. The take-home message is morality is contextual, all right? Morality develops, but it is based on your context.